My name is Mara Keene, and I was 38 years old the morning my parents smiled at my grandfather's will reading. Not cried, not trembled, smiled. It was a gray Monday in Erie, Pennsylvania, the kind of winter morning that made every window look dirty, no matter how clean it was. I sat at the long conference table inside Jordan Voss's law office, with my hands folded around my grandfather's pocket watch. Across from me, my father, Russell Keene, kept smoothing the front of his black coat like he was preparing for a photograph. My mother, Beverly, sat beside him with her purse on her lap, chin lifted, eyes dry. My brother Caleb was at the end of the table, tapping his thumb against his phone screen, already bored by grief. They thought this was a formality. 9 months earlier, Grandpa Walter had sold the surface land of his old farm for $1.45 million and handed every cent to my parents. They told everyone he had done it because he trusted them. They said it was proof of love. They said he wanted Russell to handle things properly. What he had actually asked for was much smaller. Keep me home. 3 words. That was all. Now he was gone, and the people who had treated those words like a suggestion were sitting in a lawyer's office, waiting to be rewarded for breaking them. Jordan Voss opened a leather folder. He read the first few lines calmly. My mother's smile softened, almost becoming pleasant. Then Jordan stopped. He reached beneath the table and lifted a narrow metal box onto the polished wood. It landed with a quiet sound that changed the air in the room. Before I read the next line, he said, looking directly at me, Mr. Keene left one instruction. Only Mara may unlock this file. My mother's smile disappeared before I even found the key. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 58% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. All right. Enough talking. Let's begin the story. To understand why that metal box changed the room, you have to go back 9 months. To the afternoon my grandfather sold the part of his farm everyone thought was worthless. Walter Keene owned 12 acres outside Erie, Pennsylvania. A flat, stubborn piece of land with a leaning red barn, 2 old maples by the drive, and a rusted rail spur half buried in weeds behind the equipment shed. Most of us had stopped seeing the rail line years ago. It was just part of the background, like the cracked fence posts and the ditch that filled every spring. But the land also sat beside an old utility corridor, close enough to existing transmission access that a solar company saw something my family never bothered to understand. To us, it looked like weeds and rust. To them, it looked like access. My father called the farm dead weight. My mother called it taxes with a mailbox. My brother Caleb called it a missed opportunity, which was what Caleb called anything he hoped would someday pay his debts. Grandpa never argued with them. He had spent 41 years as a railroad mechanic, and he had the patience of a man used to listening for trouble before it broke something important. When the offer came in for $1.45 million, my parents acted relieved, almost grateful, as if the farm had finally apologized for being inconvenient. We gathered at their kitchen table the day the wire cleared. Beverly had made coffee she never touched. Russell kept glancing at his phone and pretending he was not waiting for the bank notification. Caleb arrived in a sport coat, which told me he expected money to become a family conversation before the afternoon was over. Grandpa sat at the end of the table, both hands folded over his silver pocket watch. Every night, at 8:15, he wound that watch and held it to his ear, listening for the tick like it was telling him whether the world was still honest. My father cleared his throat. Dad, you know we'll handle everything. Grandpa looked at him for a long time. I'm not asking for everything, he said. I'm asking for one thing. My mother smiled too quickly. Of course. He turned to Russell. Keep me home. That was all. No attorney, no contract, no caregiver agreement. Just an old man handing his son more money than any of us had ever seen, and asking not to be moved somewhere strange when his body started needing help. I felt something tighten in my chest. Grandpa, I asked, shouldn't this be in writing? Beverly's eyes cut toward me. Caleb gave a small laugh, like I had embarrassed everyone. But Grandpa only touched the edge of his watch and smiled. "Some promises don't need paper, Mara," he said. Then his eyes moved back to my father. "Some people do." At the time, I thought he was being stubborn. Later, I understood he was taking notes. For the next few months, nothing looked cruel from the outside. That is the part people miss about a family falling apart. It does not always begin with yelling. Sometimes it begins with fresh curtains in a back bedroom, a new pill organizer on the dresser, and my mother telling everyone at church how blessed they were to still have Walter with them. I wanted to believe her. When I visited, the house looked arranged for proof. Grandpa's room was clean, the blankets tucked square, his medications lined up with their labels facing forward. But something about him seemed carefully placed, like a thing people were keeping because throwing it away would look bad. His lunch tray was always gone before I arrived. His chair was always pushed too close to the window. And when I asked him how he was, he would touch his pocket watch and say, "Still ticking." Then came November 14. The first real snow of the season had started before sunset, wet and heavy, turning the roads silver under the streetlights. I was at my kitchen table, reviewing denied claims for a home health agency, when my phone rang at 10:37 p.m. The number was unfamiliar, but something in me answered before I could think. "This is Simone Reddick," the woman said. "I'm a night nurse at St. Agnes." I stood up. "Is my grandfather okay?" "He's medically stable," she said carefully. "He was discharged almost 2 hours ago." I waited. "Your parents signed the paperwork," she continued, lowering her voice. "They told the desk someone was coming back for him. No one has." For a moment, the room around me seemed to narrow. "He's alone?" "He's in the discharge waiting area," she said. "He keeps asking if his granddaughter is coming." I drove there in 22 minutes. I remember because the dashboard clock was the only thing I let myself look at. The roads were slick, the windshield blurred white, and every red light felt personal. The discharge area was almost empty when I walked in. One vending machine hummed beside the elevators. A janitor dragged a yellow mop bucket across the tile. A television mounted too high on the wall played a cooking show no one was watching. And beneath it sat my grandfather. He wore a thin brown coat, the wrong one for that weather, and held his metal lunchbox with both hands. His overnight bag rested by his shoes. His hat was damp around the brim. The silver chain of his pocket watch disappeared into his coat like one last thread tying him to himself. When he saw me, his face did not break. That might have been easier. He only looked relieved and said, "I knew you'd come." I knelt in front of him and took his cold hands in mine. Behind us, the automatic doors kept opening and closing, letting in small gusts of snow, as if the whole building could not decide whether to shelter him or send him back out. I did not take him back to my parents' house. I did not call Russell from the hospital parking lot and ask him to explain how an 83-year-old man ended up alone in a discharge waiting area during the first snow of the season. I did not give Beverly the chance to turn it into confusion, exhaustion, miscommunication, or any of the soft words people reach for when the truth has sharp edges. I helped my grandfather into my car, set his overnight bag in the back seat, and drove him to my apartment with the heater turned up until the windows fogged. He kept his metal lunchbox on his lap the whole way. My place was never meant for 2 people. It was a 1-bedroom above a closed florist shop, with narrow stairs, old radiators, and a bathroom door that stuck whenever the weather changed. I gave Grandpa the bedroom before he could argue. He stood in the doorway, looking at my unmade bed, the stack of insurance files on the nightstand, and the laundry basket I had not folded in 3 days. "Mara," he said, "I can take the couch." "No," I said. That was the first full sentence I trusted myself to speak since St. Agnes. By morning, my life had become a list. Blood pressure cuff, pill organizer, non-slip bath mat, shower chair, cardiology follow-up, pharmacy calls, insurance calls. Work files moved from the kitchen table, so he had somewhere to eat. I used to be a home care nurse, so I knew the steps. That did not make them lighter. Knowing what care requires does not mean you suddenly have more hours, more money, or a second pair of hands. Simone must have flagged the discharge, because 3 days later, a hospital social worker named Naomi called to check on him. Her voice was calm in the way people sound when they have heard every version of a family pretending nothing happened. "Document everything," she told me. "I'm not trying to start something," I said. "I didn't say you were," Naomi replied. "I'm telling you to protect the truth before someone else edits it." So I kept a notebook. Medication changes, receipts, missed calls, the time Simone called me, the fact that my parents had signed discharge papers and left. Meanwhile, Beverly started editing. At church, she told people Grandpa had become difficult. In the family group chat, she said I had overreacted. By the end of that first week, the story had already shifted. I had not rescued him. I had taken him. Grandpa never corrected anyone. He only sat at my small kitchen table, wound his pocket watch at 8:15, and thanked me every night like I had given him a mansion instead of my bedroom and the last quiet corner of my life. A week later, the first bill that felt real came from the pharmacy. The hospital numbers were still floating somewhere in the system, waiting for insurance to decide what kind of mercy it felt like offering. I could almost ignore those because they were not final yet. But the pharmacy receipt was final. It was printed in black ink, folded once, and slid across the counter by a woman who looked too tired to soften bad news. Dr. Priya Nair, the geriatric specialist Naomi helped me get in with, had changed Grandpa's heart medication after reviewing his discharge notes. She was kind, direct, and careful with him. She explained why the old dose was not enough anymore, why the new one mattered, and why missing it could put him right back in the hospital. Then the pharmacist handed me the receipt. $312. Grandpa stood beside me with one hand on the cart and the other tucked inside his coat pocket. I knew his fingers were closed around that pocket watch. He pretended not to notice the number. I pretended not to notice him pretending. That was how we protected each other in public. I paid with a credit card I had no business using. That night, after he went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the receipt beside my laptop. My checking account balance looked less like a number and more like a warning. Rent was due in 9 days. My work hours had been cut because one of the home health agencies lost a contract. The shower chair, the extra groceries, the copays, the heat I kept running because Grandpa got cold under 2 blankets, none of it cared how tired I was. I stared at my phone for almost 20 minutes before calling my mother. Beverly answered on the 4th ring. "What is it, Mara?" No hello. No asking how he was. I kept my voice flat. "Grandpa's medication changed. It's $312 a month now. I need you and Dad to help cover it." There was a pause. In the background, I heard a cabinet close. Then my father's voice, low, asking who it was. "It's Mara," Beverly said, as if my name had become a chore. I waited for Russell to take the phone. He didn't. "Your father and I already rearranged our lives for him," she said. "You know that. You have the money he gave you to keep him home." Her breath sharpened, but her voice stayed smooth. "You chose to take him." I looked toward the bedroom door. A thin line of warm light showed underneath it. "He was left at a hospital. He was difficult," she said. "And now he is your responsibility." I wrote the number on the pharmacy receipt. $312. Under it, I wrote her sentence. Your responsibility. One was the cost of keeping his heart steady. The other was the price of finally understanding my parents. The next morning, I tried to slide the pharmacy receipt under a stack of insurance forms before Grandpa came into the kitchen. Not because he did not know money was tight. He knew. Walter Keene could read pressure in a room the way he used to read pressure in a rail line. He noticed when I rinsed a coffee cup instead of running the dishwasher. He noticed when I stood in front of the thermostat too long before turning it up. He noticed when I smiled too quickly and said I had already eaten. He found the receipt anyway. I was on a call with a claims supervisor when he moved the papers aside to make room for his lunchbox. By the time I came back, he was sitting at the table with the pharmacy slip in one hand and an old nursing badge in the other. The badge must have fallen out of the folder where I kept the things I was too tired to throw away. "You still keep this?" he asked. I reached for it, but he held it a second longer. It doesn't mean anything now, I said. I'm not licensed to practice anymore. That wasn't what I asked. I sat across from him. Outside, snowmelt tapped from the awning over the closed florist shop. The apartment smelled like toast, Vicks, and the lemon cleaner I used to make the place feel less like a sick room. I wasn't trying to be a nurse again, I said. I had this idea once. A care coordination service. Something for families trying to keep an aging parent at home without drowning. Medication schedules, insurance calls, rides to appointments, safety checks, help understanding what the doctor actually said, the things people need, before everything turns into a crisis. Grandpa listened without interrupting. What happened? I looked at the receipt on the table. I ran out of money. Then I ran out of energy. Then I convinced myself it was a bad idea, so quitting would feel practical instead of sad. He laid the badge flat and smoothed one corner with his thumb. Bad ideas don't keep waking people up at night, he said. After that, he started asking questions. Real ones. What would 1 week of help cost? Who needed it most? What did insurance refuse to cover? What did families pretend they understood because they were embarrassed? What did old people stop asking for because they hated feeling expensive? By lunch, the back of an envelope was covered in his blocky handwriting. By dinner, we had turned it into something that almost looked like a plan. Not a company yet. Not even close. A bridge, Grandpa said, tapping the paper. People don't always need saving all at once. Sometimes they just need someone to get them across the worst part. I looked at the receipt, then at the old badge, then at him eating soup at my kitchen table, like he had not just handed me back a piece of myself. For the first time in months, I did not feel like I was only surviving the day. I felt like we might be building something inside it. For 3 days, the envelope stayed in the back of my mind like a sound I could not place. I found it on a Friday afternoon, while Grandpa was napping, and I was cleaning the small pile of things that had migrated to his nightstand. Pill bottles, a half-finished crossword, the silver pocket watch folded in his handkerchief, a grocery receipt where he had written one word twice in pencil, bridge, bridge, as if he was testing the shape of it. When I lifted the pill organizer to wipe the table, a cream-colored envelope slid out from underneath it and landed face down on the floor. It was heavier than a normal envelope. Not thick enough to be a stack of documents, but not empty either. The kind of paper lawyers use when they want even silence to feel official. In the upper left corner was a name I had never heard before. Jordan Voss, attorney at law, estate and trust planning. Paper clipped to the front was a small appointment card. The date was the following Wednesday, 11 in the morning. Under the time, someone had written 5 words in dark blue ink. Bring the watch key. I sat back on my heels and held it longer than I should have. There are moments in life when doing the wrong thing would be easy enough to explain later. I could have told myself I was protecting him. I could have said I needed to know what my parents might try next. I could have opened that envelope in the name of caution and made it sound almost noble. But the truth was simpler. It was not mine. Grandpa had already lost his farm, his room, his place at my parents' table, and the right to be believed without proof. I was not going to take his privacy too. So I put the appointment card back exactly as I had found it. I slid the envelope beneath the pill organizer, wiped the table, and stood up. That was when I saw him watching me from the bedroom doorway. He looked smaller in my old robe, one hand braced against the frame, the other closed around his pocket watch. His eyes moved from my face to the nightstand and back again. You saw it, he said. I did not lie. Yes. And? I put it back. For a long moment, he said nothing. The radiator knocked once, then went quiet. Outside, a truck passed slowly through the slush. Grandpa looked down at the watch in his hand and rubbed his thumb over the worn silver lid. Good, he said softly. Some doors should only open when it's time. Then he walked back to bed, and I stood there understanding, without understanding at all, that I had just passed a test no one had told me I was taking. The following Wednesday, Grandpa was ready before I was. When I came out of the bathroom, still buttoning my sweater, He was sitting on the edge of the bed in a pressed blue shirt I had never seen him wear in my apartment. His hair was combed neatly back. His shoes were polished. The silver pocket watch sat in his palm, open, ticking softly like it had an appointment of its own. "You don't have to dress up for a lawyer," I said, trying to sound lighter than I felt. He closed the watch and slipped it into his vest pocket. "You dress for the things that matter." I did not argue with that. The roads were clear by then, but dirty snow still lined the curbs in gray piles. He sat beside me with both hands folded over the watch, looking out the window as we drove through streets he had probably known before half the buildings had names. We passed the old rail yard on the east side, rusted tracks cutting behind chain-link fence, and his eyes stayed on it until it disappeared behind us. Jordan Voss's office was in a brick building near the courthouse, the kind with brass lettering on the directory and carpet that made every footstep sound careful. In the elevator, Grandpa reached into his watch and did something with his thumb that I could not see. When his hand came out, it was closed. A key, I thought. Not brass, not old-looking, small and silver, hidden where no one would ever think to look unless he wanted them to. At the front desk, he gave his name. The receptionist stood immediately, like she had been expecting him. A minute later, Jordan Voss stepped into the waiting room. He was in his mid-50s, trim, quiet, with reading glasses tucked into the pocket of his suit jacket. He shook Grandpa's hand first. Then he turned to me. "You must be Mara." It was not a question. I nodded. His expression did not change, but something in the way he looked at me made me feel as if I had been discussed in a room I had never entered. Grandpa touched my wrist. "Stay here, kid." The door closed behind them. I sat under a framed photograph of Lake Erie and listened to the muffled shape of voices through the wall. 48 minutes passed. I counted because counting was easier than wondering. When the door opened again, Grandpa came out tired, but not defeated. There was a looseness in his shoulders I had not seen since before the hospital. Jordan walked him to the lobby and said, "I'll handle the rest." Grandpa nodded. In the car, I waited until he buckled his seatbelt before asking, "Did you fix what you needed to fix?" He looked down at the closed watch in his palm. "I fixed the part I waited too long to fix," he said. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let me drive him home in silence. He was quieter after that visit. Not sad, not afraid, just finished in some private way I could not reach. He still came to the kitchen table every morning. He still asked about the care coordination plan, still corrected my numbers when I underestimated mileage, still wound his pocket watch at 8:15 each night with the same steady hands, but something in him had settled, like a train finally eased into its last station. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, I woke before my alarm because the apartment felt different. I cannot explain that without sounding dramatic, and I hate dramatic. It was not a sound, it was the absence of one. No soft cough from the bedroom, no slow shuffle toward the bathroom, no drawer opening for his socks, just the radiator ticking and the city waking up outside the windows. I stood in the hallway for a moment before I opened the door. Grandpa was in bed, turned slightly toward the window, his face calm in the pale morning light. The metal lunchbox had been wiped clean and set on the chair beside him. His pocket watch rested on the nightstand, closed, with the chain coiled neatly beside it. He had left things in order. That was so much like him that it hurt worse than if he had left a mess. I sat beside him for a long time. I did not say anything useful. There are no useful words when someone who filled a room quietly is suddenly gone from it. Eventually, I called Dr. Nayar's office line, then the funeral home Naomi had recommended, then my parents, because they were his family, even if they had forgotten what that meant. Beverly answered on the second ring. "Mom?" I said. "Grandpa passed this morning." There was silence. For one breath, I thought grief might still find her. Then she asked, "Did he say anything about papers?" I looked at the pocket watch on the nightstand. "No," I said. "Are you sure?" I hung up before I said something I could never take back. At the funeral, Beverly wore charcoal gray and cried with perfect timing. She held Russell's arm, accepted casseroles, touched people's hands, and told them Walter had been so difficult near the end, but we did everything we could. Marta Gill from church hugged her and looked at me over Beverly's shoulder with careful disappointment. Caleb gave me a nod, like we were distant co-workers. Russell barely spoke. He stood near the guest book, pale and stiff, watching the floor as if it might open and read out what he had done. I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, because Grandpa had taught me the difference between noise and record. And somewhere, in Jordan Voss's office, there was a record waiting to speak louder than I ever could. 10 days after the funeral, Jordan Voss's letter arrived in a cream envelope with my name typed so neatly it looked almost cold. I opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where Grandpa and I had planned a bridge for people who were tired of pretending they were not drowning. The apartment had changed in ways I kept discovering by accident. His chair stayed pushed in. His lunchbox sat on the counter because I had not found the courage to put it away. At 8:15 each night, my eyes still moved toward the pocket watch before I remembered there was no one left to wind it. The letter was brief. The reading of Walter Keene's will would take place the following Friday at 11 in the morning. Attendance requested: Russell Keene, Beverly Keene, Caleb Keene, Mara Keene, and 2 witnesses named by the estate. At the bottom, in Jordan's handwriting, was one sentence: "Please bring the watch." I read it 3 times. That evening, Caleb called me. Not texted. Called. That alone told me Beverly was standing somewhere nearby, directing traffic. "You got the letter?" he asked. "Yes." He sighed, like I had already become difficult without saying anything. "Look, Mara, don't make this weird." I looked across the table at the pocket watch, resting on a folded dish towel. "I wasn't planning to. Mom's worried you're going to turn this into one of your moral crusades." There it was, the family translation. Telling the truth was drama. Asking for accountability was cruelty. Remembering what happened accurately was a crusade. "I'm going to listen to the lawyer," I said. Caleb gave a short laugh. "Fine. Just don't embarrass yourself. Grandpa already gave Mom and Dad the real money. Whatever's left is probably tools, papers, that old watch you carry around like a shrine." I did not answer. After he hung up, I sat there for a long time, not angry exactly. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was heavier than that. They were not afraid I would lie. They were afraid I would remember. The morning of the reading was clear and bitter cold. I dressed in a navy coat, Grandpa had once said, made me look capable, which from him meant beautiful. I placed the pocket watch in my purse, wrapped in his handkerchief, and drove to Jordan Voss's office with both hands tight on the wheel. Beverly was already in the waiting room when I arrived. Russell sat beside her, shoulders rounded, eyes on the carpet. Caleb leaned against the window, scrolling his phone. My mother looked at my purse and smiled. "Still carrying that old thing?" I touched the clasp. "Yes," I said. He asked me to. Jordan opened the conference room door a minute later and called us in. The room looked smaller than it had in my memory, though I had only imagined it before. A long table, 6 chairs, a window facing the courthouse steps. A metal box, already sitting beside Jordan's leather folder, narrow and gray, with a lock no bigger than a thumbnail. Beverly noticed it immediately, but she looked away as if refusing to give it importance would make it unimportant. We sat down. I kept my purse in my lap. Jordan began with the ordinary things. Grandpa left his tools to Hank Platt, an old friend from the rail yard. A small donation to the church heating fund. His metal lunchbox to me. The pocket watch to me as well, though I already had it, wrapped in cloth beneath my hand. Caleb shifted in his chair. Beverly's shoulders relaxed. Russell did not move. Then Jordan turned a page. "The remainder of my estate," he read, "shall be determined by the contents of Parcel 9 Rail Corridor rights, held in secured file, to be opened only by my granddaughter, Mara Keene." My mother's head came up. "What does that mean?" she asked. Jordan did not answer her. He looked at me. "Mr. Keene asked that you open it." My fingers felt clumsy as I unwrapped the watch. I had never opened the back before, I had never needed to, but there was a tiny seam beneath the hinge, and when I pressed it the way I had seen Grandpa do in the elevator weeks earlier, a small silver key slid into my palm. No one spoke. I stood, walked to the metal box, and fit the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost gently. Inside was a thick file with Grandpa's handwriting across the tab. Parcel nu. Jordan removed the documents and laid them on the table. He explained it in a voice so calm, it made the room feel colder. Grandpa had sold the surface land to the solar company, but he had never sold the rail corridor rights tied to the old spur. He had kept the easements, the access agreements, and the infrastructure rights connected to future energy storage and transmission use. For years, they had looked like forgotten paperwork. Then the solar development made them valuable, very valuable. Jordan turned the final valuation page toward us. Just over $20 million. Caleb whispered something I could not understand. Beverly stared at the number like it had insulted her. Russell closed his eyes. Then, Jordan read the next line. The sum of $1,450,000 previously transferred to Russell Keene is to be treated as an advance against inheritance, not a gift. My mother stood so fast her chair struck the wall. That is impossible. Jordan looked at her over his glasses. No, he said. It is documented. Beverly stared at Jordan as if calm itself had become an insult. You're telling me my husband's father gave away almost $1.5 million, and now you people are pretending it was some kind of loan? She said. He was old. He was sick. She had him in that apartment for weeks. She got in his ear. Jordan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Dr. Priya Nair completed a capacity evaluation before Mr. Keene signed the updated estate documents, he said. Naomi Bell provided a timeline of care after the hospital discharge. Hank Platt witnessed Mr. Keene's statements regarding the rail corridor file. Everything is in order. Caleb looked at me then, really looked at me, like I had turned into a person he could not categorize fast enough. Russell still had his eyes closed. Only his hands moved, tightening together on the table until his knuckles turned pale. Beverly pointed at me. You stole this family from us. That was when I finally stood. Not quickly, not dramatically. I just stood because I was done sitting beneath words that had been bent into weapons for too many years. No, I said. You thought the money meant he was finished. I thought the promise meant he still mattered. The room went quiet. I looked at my father then. For 1 second, I saw something break across his face. Shame. Maybe. Grief. Recognition arriving too late to be useful. But he did not speak. He looked down, the way he had looked down, in every hard moment of his life, and let my mother fill the silence for him. So I picked up the pocket watch, the file, and the truth my grandfather had left in writing. I did not argue with them after that. The money did not make grief easier. People think it would. It does not. It pays lawyers. It pays taxes. It opens doors. But it does not put an old man back at your kitchen table, tapping an envelope and calling your half-dead dream a bridge. A year later, I used part of the trust to build that bridge anyway. The Walter Home Fund started small. Prescription help, rides to appointments, emergency ramps, overnight respite care for families who were one bad week away from giving up. Then came the coordination service. Schedules, insurance calls, medication lists, safety checks, plain language care plans. Nothing glamorous. Just the things that keep people from becoming problems in houses where love has started to run out of money. Beverly sends messages sometimes. I do not answer most of them. Russell mailed one apology, 3 pages long. I keep it unopened in a drawer. The pocket watch sits on my desk now. The silver key hangs beside my door. A wire transfer can clear in 1 second, but keeping a promise takes the rest of your life. What Mara learned was not that money reveals everything. Money only gives people permission to stop pretending. The real lesson was quieter than that. A promise is not proven by a signature, a speech, or a family name. A promise is proven in the small, inconvenient moments when nobody is clapping for you. It is proven when the medication costs more than you expected, when the appointment runs late, when the person you love becomes slower, weaker, more dependent, and the world starts asking whether they are still worth the trouble. Walter did not need someone to love him perfectly. He needed someone to come back. That is what family is supposed to mean. Not the people who smile in public and rewrite the story afterward. Not the people who accept the money, but reject the responsibility. Family is the person who answers the phone at 10:37 p.m. Family is the person who makes room in a one-bedroom apartment. Family is the person who protects your dignity when you can no longer protect it alone. And sometimes, the strongest people are not the ones who fight the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones who keep records, keep promises, keep showing up, and refuse to become cruel just because cruelty would be easier. Mara did not win because she inherited $20 million. She won because she did not let betrayal make her smaller. She turned grief into a bridge. She used what Walter left behind to help other families before they reached the breaking point. That is resilience. Not pretending the pain never happened, but building something decent from the place where it broke you. So, maybe the question this story leaves us with is simple. When someone you love becomes inconvenient, who do you become? Do you become the person who counts the cost and walks away? Or do you become the person who remembers that love is not what we say when life is easy? Love is what we do when it costs us something. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen someone in your family show their true character when responsibility became difficult? I'd really like to read your story. And if this story stayed with you, please hit like, subscribe, and come back for the next one.